Greetings and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us live for today's MAI webinar, How to Write Compelling Stories for Fiction or Nonfiction Projects with Tessa Afshar. This is Ramon Rocha of Media Associates International. We are so encouraged to see 71 of you from 25 countries register for this webinar. And we thank God for this opportunity, this privilege to be together even through technology. We value your interaction. Please use the chat for your comments about the webinar or topic, and you can chat with one another if you like. And please use the Q&A for your questions. Sometimes stories, illustrations, anecdotes by our pastor stay with us longer than his actual three-point sermon. Jesus himself used parables, short local color stories so effectively in his ministry and teachings recorded in the Gospels. When we read nonfiction books, we like reading interesting and engaging stories that the author has so creatively woven into his or her discussion of the topic. Novels with gripping stories keep us glued to it, and it's hard to put it down. We are drawn and hooked by these stories. So I'm excited and looking forward to our topic this morning, how to write compelling stories for fiction or nonfiction projects. And I'm eager to hear from our speaker, Tessa Afshar. Tessa is an award-winning and best-selling author. Her book on the Book of Ruth, entitled The Way Home, God's Invitation to New Beginnings, published by Moody Publishers, won the 2021 ECPA Christian Book of the Year Award in the Bible Study category. Her other biblical and historical titles have won recognition from INSPY, Christy Award, and the ACFW Carroll Award. Her books have been translated to 11 languages. A bit of background about Tessa. Tessa was born in the Middle East, moved to England at 14 years old with her mom and sister, then later moved to the US to go to college, and has lived here in the US since. I was reading your testimony, Tessa, and you said, when you turned 25, you went through a devastating experience, that you felt like a big failure, so you were down and out, bordering on hopelessness. That was when you had a dramatic encounter with Jesus in a dream. That's interesting. And that you've never read the Bible yet at that time, and your only exposure to Jesus was in the films you've watched on some Easter or Christian or Christmas specials. Well, we will not talk about your testimony in this webinar, sadly, but I invite our audience to read her testimony, if you haven't done so yet, at her website at tessaafshar.com. So without further ado, we are so honored to have you, Tessa. Please come and start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Ramon, for that introduction. Hi, everybody. It's such a joy and honor to be with you all. I mean, thinking about the fact that there are 25 countries represented here this morning makes me feel like we're in a corner of heaven and how it will be. And I cannot wait to meet you in person one day. Maybe on this earth even, maybe at a lit world when I'm able to go and you're able to go. We do have a lot of ground to cover in 35 minutes today. I normally would have assigned maybe 4 hours to a teaching like this, but in order to cover as much as I possibly can, I'm going to kind of jump in without further ado. We're going to cover how to write compelling stories, both for fiction and a novel length book, and nonfiction. So for nonfiction, you could have a book length nonfiction story that uses, so here are two books, Boys in the Boat and Seabiscuit. These are true stories, but they've been written using all the techniques that I'm going to talk about today in terms of writing a good and compelling story. Or most of the things that I'm going to tell you will also work in the shorter stories that you're going to tell in the course of a nonfiction book. And those are, of course, much shorter, but some of the principles can apply. In order to cover ground more completely, I've sort of cut our discussion into 3 sections, 3 categories, if you will. In real life, they really dovetail and intermingle, but we're going to, for clarity, sort of treat them all very separately. So the first one is skillful writing, which I'm happy to tell you is something you can learn. Like, you don't have to come out of your mother's womb knowing how to write. You can learn the skill with experience and with practice. And I will tell you a couple of easy ways to do that. And the second part of our presentation is going to be about captivating plotting. And the final part, which is the shortest part, is going to be about knowing your reader's needs, and as you're writing, keeping that in mind. So the craft of writing and the technical skills that it requires for you to be a compelling writer, a storyteller, is essentially the best way to learn it is to keep writing. And the second best way to learn it is to keep reading. Because even if you're reading books that are not good, you learn from the mistakes of the writer what not to do. But if you have favorite books that you go back to again and again, or favorite stories, just go over them and try and pull apart, what is it that speaks to me, especially in terms of some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is that whenever you tell a story, whether it's a long story or just a short narrative in the context of a nonfiction book, you are going to tell 2 things besides your story. The first thing is what I call a world building. So you're going to talk about the world in which the story occurs. For me, as a historical fiction writer, this is really important because most of my readers will never have known that world. They will not have entered it. So I have to create a world from scratch for them. So as they're reading a story, they feel like they are now inhabiting that world. They're there. They're not sitting home in their comfortable pajamas. They are now suddenly in this first century Roman world, for example. But you may be writing a contemporary story and you think, well, I don't have to be world building, but you do. Because let's say you live in Africa and you want to tell a story about someone in a village. Now, one of your readers is going to be someone who lives in a city, was born in a city, and that's all they know. So you have to create that world of the village life for them in such a way that they can enter it and they can feel like, oh, this is a world that I get. This is a world I connect with. I can smell it. I can see it. So you have to build a world besides telling a story. The second thing you have to do besides telling a story is reveal the history or the backstory of your character, of your main hero. And because that backstory is going to tell you, is going to inform the story in some ways. So that's a lot of information. What does this world look like? And what's the history of your writer, of your hero? As new writers, the biggest temptation is to try and dump all of that information up front and to try and sort of tell everybody, like, okay, this is what everything looks like. This is what went on before. And now we start our story. And that's a big mistake because those are facts that are going to bog down your readers. They're going to get bored. And so the best thing you can do is actually save those things. And only every once in a while, give me a thread, give me a little bit, a little glimpse of backstory, and give me a little bit of what that world looks like very effectively. And you have to be very judicious in the release of that information. This is true, by the way, for the short stories that you tell in the context of a nonfiction book. So for example, in my Bible study, I wanted to tell a story about my mom making a dress. She worked in the fashion industry at the time. She was making a dress. She didn't know who it was for. And later on, she saw Princess Diana wearing it. And so I had to make a decision. Do I tell my readers about the fact that my mom went to school for this? Or where did my mom go to school for this? Or, what was the backstory? How did she end up in this industry? Did I tell all of that? And I decided, no, I wouldn't. That I wanted the story to begin just with her working in the fashion. So I'm giving a little bit of backstory, but not too much, because I wanted to focus on the story itself so that the readers would have an emotional experience. At the end, it's the point of the story that matters, particularly in those short stories, examples, because I wanted my readers to have an emotional connection. They're never gonna make a dress for Princess Diana. But the point of the story is that sometimes in life, God will give you something to do that has a profound effect, and you don't know it at the time that you're doing it. And so that was the point. I didn't want to bog down the emotional impact of the story by giving too much information. So you really have to learn how to do this, how to build the world. So the starting point of your story is really important. And that's important in novels as well. Where does your story actually begin? And what is the backstory? I'll give a novel length example of the beginning of your story, because this is so important. So many new writers of novels make a mistake, and they have about 20, 30 pages at the beginning of their book that shouldn't be there. That's not the beginning of their story. That should be kind of cut away, and you start on page 31. So one example is my book, Land of Silence. Land of Silence is about the woman with the issue of blood, the woman who bled for 12 years before she touched the hem of Jesus' garment and was healed. And in that moment, Jesus looks at her and calls her daughter. Daughter, your faith has healed you. But it's the only place in the Gospels where Jesus calls someone personally daughter. He calls them daughter of Abraham, but never daughter. We know, of course, from the New Testament that those who love Jesus are now called sons and daughters of God. But this is the only place that Jesus calls her daughter. So that was, for me, the question. Why does Jesus do this? Why does Jesus decide to call her daughter, to delay a very urgent situation in order to impart this knowledge to her, that he fathers her? And that's how the story begins. The story begins with the moment when she stopped being a daughter and why she needs to hear that she is a daughter. Okay, so that's the first part in terms of the technical I wanted to talk to you about, the starting point of your story, and also revealing your world, building your world, and revealing the backstory in a judicious way. So anything else that happens before that point, that's your backstory, and you have to give it to your readers very carefully. The second issue that I want to talk to you about writing a story is pacing. Now, what do I mean by pacing? Sometimes you pick up a novel, particularly if you read old novels, and that novel is really slow to start for our modern mind. Or halfway through the novel, you suddenly enter into a sag where things seem to be kind of boring in comparison to the beginning. Or you get to the end and all of a sudden it gets really fast and things kind of resolve without being really satisfying. So your pacing is the pace and that the story is unraveled, and you want that pace to be tight, you want that pace to be steady, and you want to capture the attention of the reader right from the first line. This is true for the culture that I write for, the Western culture. A lot of my readers belong to the Western culture, although I also have readers around the world. But in your culture, your readers may have more grace for a slow beginning, for example. Maybe they're used to kind of a slow build-up. But for the majority of my readers, they expect to be hooked within seconds of picking up a book. So by the second sentence, by the third sentence, they need to know what is going on that is going to capture my curiosity, that is going to capture my interest. So one of the ways you are going to manage your pacing is actually through a technical means, and that is by culling, by getting rid of unnecessary words, using the appropriate words, getting rid of unnecessary words. Don't use too many adjectives. Don't use too many adverbs. Use strong verbs. So I'll give you an example. This morning, I'm working on the first line. I keep rewriting. I'm working on a new novel, and I keep rewriting that first line to get it just right. And the first line had to do with the heroine waking up. She hears a sound in the middle of the night, and it wakes her up. And I realized that wake up was too weak a verb. So I changed it to she was startled awake. And I took the word was out. So I said, you know, that this noise startled her awake. So I kept taking words out, but putting words that are stronger into that sentence so that the sentence will capture your imagination and also draw a feeling out of you right from the beginning. The language of English has a lot of words. I think it has more words than most languages in the world, if not all languages. And the reason is English has sticky fingers. All throughout its history, it's grabbed words from other languages. It has French words, Greek words, it has even Arabic words, and I think Persian words. So it's got this arsenal of huge number of words that you can choose, and so you have to be very judicious in terms of what you choose. Your language may not have as many words. I speak Persian, and Persian does not have nearly as many words as English does. But the words that are there have an emotional, there are a lot of words that have emotional weight. And so you can use those words that have emotional weight. But sometimes, so for example, if your language doesn't have any word for walking slow, in English I can say plod, but your language doesn't have that word, you're going to have to use an adverb. But whenever possible, don't use an adverb and use a better verb or word. Another way to control your pacing is dialogue. Dialogue speeds up any writing. So even in a short section, in a short story, you can use dialogue. It doesn't all have to be telling, it can be showing through dialogue. So make your dialogue sparkling. On the one hand, your dialogue has to capture the reality. So they have to talk like your characters. So if my character is living in a village in, let's say, 400 BC Babylon, she can't sound like a British person who lives today. She has to sound kind of like that. And so you have to make the dialogue true to the person. Use humor. Don't repeat the name of a person. Sometimes it clogs your writing. When we talk together, we very rarely say each other's names. I don't keep saying, hey, Ramon, by the way, Ramon, I have to tell you that Ramon, that something happened, Ramon, you know, so don't repeat the name of the character. And that can become a little clunky. Use irony and make a lot of sort of humor and sparkly dialogue. Most of us writers write better dialogue in our writing than we do in real life. We're much more witty in our writing than we are in real life because we have time to think of witty things. There's a fun story about Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre. When it came out, everybody was amazed by the dialogue. It was just so sharp and witty. So everybody in London started inviting her into these like really important places and places where artists gathered. And Charlotte Bronte was very quiet and shy, kind of mousy character. And everybody afterwards was like, that was Charlotte Bronte who wrote Jane Eyre, but she was nothing like her dialogue. Well, because you can write amazing dialogue without having that personality in real life. So make sure that your dialogue is wonderful. And lastly, of course, there's this, what we call show, don't tell. In shorter stories, you tell a lot more. But when you are writing book length, or whether it's a novel or nonfiction, then you have to show a lot more because it's a lot more effective. So rather than saying Barbara was fearless, okay, you know, that doesn't really emotionally do anything. But how about I show that Barbara is fearless? Barbara is walking down the street when she sees a Rottweiler, how do you say that? Let's say a big dog attack an old woman bent over walking with a cane. And Barbara jumps in and grabs the dog around the neck, and the dog's maw is in her face, and she can see the dribble of down the fangs, the dribble of saliva down the fangs. And then we're told that, by the way, Barbara is only 99 pounds and 5 feet. And suddenly you get this image of a very fearless woman. So show rather than tell means that you show what you're about to tell. You have to always do some telling, otherwise your book will be 900 pages. But you have to be careful in terms of what you choose to show rather than tell. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about in this section is you have to create tension from the beginning. Tension doesn't sound very pleasant, does it? Because, you know, I don't want to be tense in real life, but strangely, when I'm reading, tension is what keeps my attention. I'll give you a couple of examples of how to create tension. One is by creating a situation of anxiety or danger or stress. So that danger could be an external danger. Someone's life is in danger. They could end up in prison, or it could be an internal danger. So one thing may be that that person, if this situation should happen, that person's going to be terribly embarrassed, or they will be shamed. You don't want them to be shamed. Or maybe they will be disappointed. They'll be left hungry. They'll be alone. Whatever it is, you're going to create some stress. Earlier in the book, you can create stress by having questions that your reader wants answered. So for example, in my book, Harvest of Rubies, the reader knows this is going to be a historical novel, but presumably they don't know anything else. And the book starts, it says, chapter 1, the 8th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, Persia. So we know this is ancient history. And the first line is, on my 12th birthday, my father discovered that I could read. So now, hopefully, the reader is curious. Wait, you're 12 and your father didn't know you could read? But what happened? Are you allowed to read? And was he happy about it? Was he sad? How did you learn to read by then without anybody finding out? So there are a lot of questions that you have created from the beginning. And hopefully that means that your reader wants to keep reading. This is something you have to do throughout your story, whether it's short or whether it's long, is to hook your reader, create tension by these means. There are other ways you create tension, but I'm just going to stay with those two. So we've talked a little bit about the skill of writing itself, writing well, writing a flowing story. Now I want to change tack and talk about a captivating storyline, or what we call a plot. What makes a plot captivating? First of all, by plot, I mean the external set of circumstances that are happening externally, that are happening in the hero's world, that correlate with the hero's internal life. This is really important, because you could write a scene that is really fun for you, that you write beautifully, but it doesn't do anything for the internal world of your main or two main characters. It's just a fun scene, and it doesn't drive the story forward in any way. And that's pretty much useless. It doesn't matter how beautifully you wrote it, you have to cut it out. You have to edit that out. The external circumstances have to be emotionally anchored to one of your hero's inner world, or anchored emotionally to the actual story itself, for the story to go forward, for the next thing to happen, for this inner world situation to resolve. This thing has to happen in the external world. And that's the first thing you need to know about the external circumstances. It has to be emotionally anchored to the story of your hero. So for that storyline to capture my heart, and it needs to, because you can't just have a storyline that's like, meh, I don't really care about it. It has to capture my heart. I need to care about your hero. So you have to write a hero right from the beginning. She hooks my curiosity, but the more I read about her, by the end of the second page, I like this hero. I want to know what's going to happen to her. I'm invested in her life. And so that's one of the ways you can write that, is to make your hero likable from the beginning. And by that, I don't mean perfect. Perfect heroes can be very annoying. Most of us can't really relate to a perfect hero. So your hero has to be imperfect, but likable. I can emotionally connect to that hero. I emotionally connect to them either because I can relate to them. I felt that way myself, or I have compassion for them. Even though I haven't felt that way, I have compassion for them. Sometimes you can start a story with a hero that's not sympathetic, but you build the sympathy into it. There's a book called A Man Called Ove, and it's a Swedish book. A Man Called Ove, O-V-E, that's spelled. And at the beginning, you are going to really be annoyed by that hero. And in fact, if someone hadn't told me hang in there, I would have put that book down. So, but because the hero is annoying, he's curmudgeonly, he is critical, he's angry all the time, and I just, don't like him. But little by little, the curtain is lifted, and I realize why he's like this. So that builds sympathy. And then he starts shifting, and I see that actually he's kind and he cares about others, and he gets invested in other people's lives. So you can bring that transformation. But if this is a first book, or if this is a first story, it's going to be harder for me to hang in there with you. So you have to, it's got to be done masterfully, and you have to develop that story. So so the first thing you have to give me is a hero that I care about. The second thing is that something happens in the external world that will turn my hero on its end. That something happens in the external world, in the plot, that will change my hero's life completely. And this is where the transformation happens. The hero starts, maybe they have a wound, maybe they have a problem, maybe they have a brokenness. By the end of the book, you want a resolution to that internal issue. The external world, something happens in that external world that starts that transformation, and the hero starts either an inner journey, sometimes an outer journey as well. A lot of my books, the hero herself is moving. So, for example, in The Land of Silence that I told you about, that the starting point was going to be something happens that makes her fatherless, that makes her needful of Jesus speaking to her, his fatherhood, to say, you are now my daughter. So I wanted to start that story at that point. And by page 9, I have told you what's happened. She's in charge of her brother, and her little brother dies in a very shocking way. The reader doesn't expect this death. And by this death, her relationship with her father, because she's been responsible for the little brother, and he was under her charge when he dies, and that rips her relationship with her father. And the rest of the book is her trying to fix things and consistently more things ripping apart until finally she comes face to face with Jesus. But that ripping of the world happens early in the novel. When you are talking about shorter story, this has to happen very quickly. And but it doesn't always have to happen in a full-length book that quickly. In my book, Land of Silence, it's not until page 31. Until page 31, we've had a prologue, sort of the backstory, a glimpse of the backstory, because that backstory is really important in the rest of the story. And then by page 31, the heroine discovers that the father she thought was alive was dead, is in fact alive. And so you have some time to release the thing that changes your hero's life. So that initial event sets your hero on either an internal search or an external search. There's a quest that begins. But if it's an external search, again, that has to hook into the internal world of your hero or heroine. It has to deal with this deeper wound. So it's not just for in my Jewel of the Nile story, it's not just about her finding the father, discovering the identity of the father. It has to do with the wound, with the father wound, and it has to do with just this essentially about her identity. And that wound, you see it sort of quickly, you see it with the book, it keeps unraveling more and more and more. You see that identity wound. And this journey is not just about finding a father, it's about looking at herself in the mirror and seeing how broken she is. And by the end, to discover that the answer to that brokenness is not the identity of her father, but is to be close to her father. Okay. The other thing that has to happen in your plot is that you have to establish a motive that holds, that's believable. So this external thing that happens that sets your hero on her journey has to be believable. It has to give her a motive that resonates with the reader, that has to be the engine behind the story. That beginning thing that you reveal by page, by whatever, that beginning thing that you reveal, that beginning hook, is usually not enough to carry your story through a full-length book. You are going to need more things to hang on that, either related to that or unrelated to that. So you're going to either need a brand new hook that this first hook led to a brand new circumstance, or this circumstance suddenly gains more importance. But the initial thing is never going to carry you all the way through your book. So you're going to have to up the ante, so to speak, as we say in English. You're going to have to ratchet up the engine behind the story. And your reader has to believe, yes, if like my heroine in Jewel of the Nile actually sneaks on a ship bound for Rome, which is a pretty extreme action to take, to stow away on a boat by herself in 1st century. But so my reader has to really believe that her motives justifies this like intense action on her behalf. So make sure that you are giving your story the appropriate motive and that holds your plot line together. Okay, so by the way, when I started writing Jewel of the Nile, my plot line was not great. my motive was not great. I initially wanted her to get to Rome because she wanted to be an architect. And my editor said, you know, not everybody's that ambitious. You want to be more universal for your readers, and that's not going to captivate everybody all the way through the book. So I sat down, and at the beginning of the book, we knew the identity of the father. So I that was the time when I was just planning the book. So I replanned the book and I changed it so she did not know the identity of her father. And that became the central motive. Now, most of the rest of us know who our fathers are, but a lot of us have father issues. Some of us love our fathers and have a great father relationship, but he's gone and we miss him. Some of us have good fathers, but even a good father can leave behind some places that are painful. And so we are interested in that issue. And some of us have terrible relationship with our fathers. And so an absent father really speaks to us. So you want to bring in universal themes as the engine of your novel so that all your readers can connect. All right. Let me see. I'm going to talk about resolution. So you're going to bring your novel to a place of resolution, and you want that resolution to be satisfying for your reader. Make sure that you spend enough time sort of satisfyingly complete every thread. Don't leave any loose thread hanging so that your reader thinks, well, what happened to so-and-so? Give them a satisfying resolution. Okay, and capture your readers' emotions. You know, as writers, you're going to have an incredible opportunity. You're going to have an incredible opportunity because we now recognize, like from brain studies, that stories literally change people's brains. A lot of people emotionally don't know how to cope with their own emotions. They don't understand why they feel what they feel. They may feel afraid, but express it as anger. They've never been taught how to identify their emotions, how to share their emotions, how to know those emotions are accepted and acceptable, how to be validated in their emotions, and finally, how to be comforted in them, how to be resolved and healed in them. When you write a story that is emotionally satisfying, you are going to be able to give your readers all of these and even sort of hopefully some healing by the end of the book. Like my first novel, Pearl in the Sand, it's based on the story of Rahab, who is a prostitute. And in that story, I posit that Rahab's father, the whole family is on the point of starvation, and he feels helpless. To save the family from starvation, he sells Rahab into prostitution. And so Rahab has this against her father all her life. And by the end of the book, I have to show a forgiveness, even though the father has never come to a point where he's been able to say to Rahab, I'm sorry. Because in order for him to do that, he has to really look into the mirror and accept what he's done to his own daughter. And he emotionally cannot do it. So Rahab has to forgive her father without ever receiving an apology. And so I hear a lot of people talk about that. A lot of people say that that really spoke to their heart. So it's an incredible opportunity as storytellers to bring healing into people's lives. I was able to validate a whole bunch of people who were unable to forgive because they said, oh, I'm not the only one. Look, here is someone whose story is different from mine, but they also could not forgive. They also were having a hard time. And then as Rahab came to a place of forgiveness, in their brain, they experienced forgiveness as if they physically had gone through it. That's how powerful a story can be in a life. So the Lord has poured into you a very powerful calling. Finally, I want to talk about your readers' needs. As you write a story, you have to know your readers' needs to write the story that's appropriate for them. For this, I'm going to just say very basic. You need to know your reader. And let's start by saying, who are you writing to? So are you writing to a Christian or are you writing to a non-Christian? It's a very big difference. Recently, I was trying to help a writer who's very talented connect with an agent, a very famous literary agent. And she wrote in her introduction, she said, my novel can speak equally to Christians and non-Christians alike. And the agent said, I'm not interested. She said, by saying that, she's telling me she doesn't know her readers, because those are two very different readers. So you need to know your readership. Are they Christian? Non-Christian? Are they women? Are they young? Are they older? Do they love historical fiction? Do they write? Do they love romance? What is it that they love to read? So know your readers before you start writing, in order to write the right story for them. I think I'm going to stop at this point to give you a chance to ask your questions, and we'll go forward that way. Ramon, how am I doing with time?
You're doing very well, Tessa. Thank you. Yeah, we would welcome questions at this time. If you have any comments or questions for Tessa, you may type in your questions or comments. The principles you've shared with us, Tessa, these are also applicable to nonfiction books, right?
Some of these principles are applicable to nonfiction books. As I said, in a nonfiction book, you're going to want to use stories. You're going to want to use stories to reach into your readers' hearts. There's a guy named Tim Schumacher. He's a writer both of fiction and nonfiction. And he says, when you are a nonfiction author, your best hope is, because you're addressing the mind, you're addressing the intellect, and your best hope is somehow getting through the mind into the heart of your reader, to sort of change them at a deep level, to capture the heart and cause them to enter into a transformation process. And so, but he says with a story, you go directly to the heart. And that's the power of the story. So even if you're writing nonfiction, you want to add stories in there to take the concept you're trying to address to the mind and bring it to the level of the heart.
Thank you.
And thank you, Sheila, for that. Very inspiring. Thank you. And thank you, Janice. Yeah. Wonderful.
And Hannah has a question. Do you have any tools or strategies you use to plan out a plot?
Yeah, Hannah, I think that for me, I start with kind of a central concept. I have to have either a character that's really captivated me, or a basic concept, just a central concept. So the book that that I'm writing right now, the central concept for me is this. It's that the central character is a young woman. Her mother has been captured by the enemy. It's during a war. Her mother has been captured by the enemy, and she and her father and her sister have to go and try to set her free. So that's it. It's sort of like this external plot. And now in order to sit down and plan out the plot, and I don't plan out the plot very minutely. Some people do. They like to have every chapter kind of worked out. And if you're writing nonfiction, you do have to do that. But for this story, I just kind of do the arc of the plot. And I like to know where she's broken from the beginning. What is the thing? What's the backstory that's caused this brokenness? I'm not going to talk about the backstory, but I'm going to bring it in little by little. Where is the brokenness? What do I want resolved by the end? And what are the things that are going to happen during that? So that's a big strategy for me, is to know kind of the beginning, the ending, the brokenness, and that hook And remember that beginning hook, which is her mother's abduction, it's not going to hold throughout the whole story. So I have a whole lot of other things that I'm adding to the story along the way. When you're writing a shorter story in terms of a nonfiction, then you don't have to do all of that. You are plotting out your chapters in terms of the concept, not in terms, and then you'd figure out what stories you want to tell for that concept.
Thank you for that question, Hannah, and excellent answer, Tessa. Churn is asking how to end a story satisfactorily. What do you mean when is a ending a satisfactory ending?
Okay, so this is where you have to know your readers. So for example, my readers, a satisfactory ending pretty much always means it has to be a happy ending, at least to some degree. It doesn't have to be perfectly resolved, but on the largest extent, I have to give them a happy ending. So you have to know your readers. Your readers may not expect a happy ending, but the satisfactory part is that the heart of your hero has changed. There's been some kind of a turning point, and your hero has now experienced an internal transformation. Maybe the external world has not changed at all. Maybe war rages on. Maybe they're about to walk out the door and you don't know if they'll live or they'll die. But you know this, that maybe they started much afraid. By the end of the novel, they're no longer afraid. There's a book called All the Light We Cannot See. There's a side character in that. That's my favorite kind of thread in that book, and it's a brilliant book. But in that side character, he's the uncle, and he is an agoraphobe. He's afraid to leave his house. I think he hasn't left his house since the First World War. It's been about 20 years. He got really damaged emotionally. Toward the end of the novel, he walks out of the house. And the only reason he walks out of the house is because he wants to protect his niece, who's one of the main characters. He wants to save her life. And he goes out, and because he has shown me how horribly difficult it is for him to even stick a foot out, let alone go into the world that he hasn't seen for 20 years. And so I was like weeping as I'm reading this scene. So you want the satisfaction of that transformation, and that transformation has to come in a way that really makes sense. It isn't like, woo, something happened and not all of a sudden I have a transformation. You have to show me that like this love relationship caused him to walk out the door.
Would you sometimes end the story, something is hanging that you intend to answer in a second book, or
Yes,
plan that
yes.
out right away, or you?
Yeah, I have done that. I don't often get to do it in my genre because each book has to be a standalone.
Okay.
So each book has to be satisfying. In certain genres, you can do that much more blatantly. In this book, for example, which is Harvest of Rubies, at the end of it, you have the satisfaction of knowing she's married, she has resolved her differences with her husband, he cares for her, and her life is really like, and she's resolved the inner issues that she started with. And from a faith perspective, life has really changed. But the husband has not said, I love you. So it's not an equal relationship. So there's a second book where we get to that, but there is enough satisfaction that when people put it down, they feel like, okay, that's okay. But you do need to know your genre and the specifics of your reader's needs in terms of knowing what your ending is going to be.
Thank you for that. Some comments here by Ruth. Thank you for that impactful and thought-provoking teaching. Benedita said, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I had the idea that people wrote what they had in their minds without thinking about the audience. So you stressed on knowing the audience and writing for them. Kayla is asking, how much time do you devote to research?
Kayla, I spend quite a lot of time because in my genre, I have to not only know the world, And so I have to look into the archaeology, I have to look into the weather, I have to look into what kind of plants, what kind of buildings, what kind of language. I also have to know what the Bible says about this story when I'm writing biblical fiction. So my research is very extensive. I spend quite a few months on it, but at some point you have to start the story. If you wait until you know everything, you'll never write. So what I do is, once I feel like I personally have a sense of the world, like I can imagine it, I can taste or smell it. Sometimes I cook the foods so I know what they taste like. But once in my own head, I feel like I have a certain amount of knowledge that the world is real, I start writing. And then during the writing, I will still do research, because you'll come across almost every page is something that you don't know. Well, what was the weather that time of year? Or did they have apples? Could they grow oranges in this part of the world? You know, things like that.
Thank you. It's a lot of work.
Yes, writing is a lot of work. You really have to love it. It's a labor of love, and you really have to know that God has called you, but you also have to know the power of it. You can change people's lives, literally. I mean, I've heard of people who said, like, that first novel, there's a scene where the novel gets the name from Pearl in the Sand. And I've heard from, like, one guy wrote, he said, I am a construction worker. I'm 250 pounds. I'm covered in tattoos, and I've never cried so hard in my life. Because, you know, he experienced belovedness and worth in that moment. When Rahab was feeling it, he was applying it to his life. And that's the power that God is handing you when you write.
Dan Runyon, question here: is it enough to know that just that my reader is a Christian, or is it better to say my reader believes she knows the Bible but has not truly experienced it the way she will once I have brought Moses truly alive via my storying techniques? Get his question.
I think in terms of, like, the publishing world, you are being very specific in terms of where is my reader at. So is it that my reader is nominally Christian but has never truly experienced the truth of the faith? I think if that is something in your world, and you know that in your world better than you know your world better than I do, if that is something very common in your world, where you have a lot of readers who are nominal Christians, who would pick up a book that has Christian themes, but they don't really have a Christian faith that's alive. If that's the situation, yes. But in our world, in the publishing world that I occupy, it's simpler than that. Non-Christians do not want to read a book that talks about faith, religion, God. So you have to come at it in much more subtly. Your stories have to be subtle. So there are a lot of Christians who write nonfiction books, for example, for a wider audience, on leadership, let's say, or on having a life of gratitude. And they bring God very subtly. They do bring God in, but very subtly. The same for fiction. There are Christian writers who write for a non-Christian audience. Christians read those books, but the book isn't in your face Christian. So you have to be much more subtle. In my world, the dichotomy is clear: Christian or non-Christian. We don't have a dichotomy for nominal Christians. You couldn't publish with a main publisher if you wrote that.
Thank you. I'll shift to the chat window. Janice is asking, in your experience, how much do you guide the characters, and how much do they guide or surprise you?
Janice, that's a great question. I think I would say 50-50. I do guide them to a certain extent. And then there are times when I want them to do something and they just plumb refuse. So in the second book that comes after this, which is Harvest of Gold, I started with the intention of the husband going to the point of having an affair. I just couldn't make him do it. He wouldn't do it. He was just too loyal. So, sometimes the characters know their mind better than I do, and I just can't make them do something. And sometimes they come up with an idea that I wasn't planning for them to come up with, and they're just very strong-minded. So yeah, in the way my internal mind works, the characters have their own say sometimes.
Thank you. Jeff is asking, do any of the principles vary for writing memoirs or biographies?
Sure. I mean, I've never written a memoir or a biography, and so I'm not. I think you probably should have like a whole other speaker for that who would capture that. But there, a lot of the principles that I gave you here also works for a biography. You still have to have that hook. You still have to know the beginning of your story. You still have to know how much of the world to give them. You still have to be very careful with the kinds of words that you're using. So a lot of it applies.
Thank you. Ruth is asking, do you think in trying to bring out our thought into our writing as Christian writers, we could lose the Bible truth? Or maybe, I don't know.
So I think if you're talking about fiction, so for example, I'm writing novels that are based on the Bible. And it seems to me, I personally don't like biblical fiction. I never did. And when I wrote my first novel, it was just sort of like a one-off in my mind. It wouldn't go away. It was a story that I wrote, and then I wanted to write something else. But at that point, there was a readership, and people were saying, no, we want more like this. And I realized that God had set me up for this. So I had to write something that it's not my favorite genre, and I had to create it in such a way that I loved writing. So one of the things I would say is, when you write fiction that's set in biblical era, or any kind of fiction, this is an amazing opportunity to bring the Bible alive, I cannot tell you how many letters I receive from readers who say to me, I don't like reading the Bible, but after reading this, I went and I read the Bible, or that you've brought the Bible to life for me in a fresh way. So you have an incredible opportunity to make the Bible relevant for people, bring the truths of the Bible to life emotionally for people, and cause them to realize the Word of God is alive and has so much power. But you have to tell the stories in a way. Obviously, when you read the story of Ruth, it's 4 pages. I wrote a whole book on the story of Ruth. And obviously there's sort of a whole lot that you're adding, but in nothing that you add is there anything that goes against either the actual story or the principles of the Bible. Everything upholds the principles of the Bible. And in that case, you are serving the Lord, I think.
Amen. What about writing for general readers? Have you had any feedback from people who don't have a relationship with Christ yet and have read your books?
Yeah, I have had my feedback, because of the topics of my novels, generally completely like pagans don't pick up my books because they know it's sort of, it has to do with biblical times. But people who have walked away from God sometimes do. People who are who used to go to church and no longer do. And I do get letters from them. There was one woman who said she went back to church because of the books, and she started a relationship with Jesus. There's a guy who said friends gave him one of the books, and he said he really enjoyed it. He still doesn't believe in God, but he really enjoyed it. So it's a seed. It's a seed that's planted. That's good.
Yes, thank you. Benedita is asking, is it acceptable to write a novel in which the bad guys win and the good guys lose? Isn't that a bad lesson to the readers?
Well, I mean, sadly, the Bible has moments like that. That's what the captivity is all about. So we know, for example, that God allowed the people of Israel to have kind of a bad ending for about 70 years. They were captured. That whole generation, they died, they suffered, or they were captured. Some of them went into slavery. And so if you leave your book at the end of that, but there's a lesson to it, and the lesson is you can't keep doing the wrong thing and expect to have a good end. You could have a good lesson in that sense. I personally, I find the world so difficult as it is. I like my good endings. So personally, I would have a really hard time writing hard endings, but there is a place for them in terms of truthfulness, in terms of sort of disciplining our hearts to be obedient.
Actually, Anton's question is related to Benedita's. Does it have to be always a happy ending? What if the hero or heroine loses or has a sad ending, which often happens in real life?
Yes, absolutely. It doesn't have to have a happy ending. I think the happy ending in those situations where your ending is not, for example, we have martyrs. We know what the ending is. They die. But it's a happy ending in the sense that we know where they're going, and they die without doubt. They die holding on firmly, or they die seeing angels like Stephen did. So Stephen's story in the book of Acts is not a happy ending because he does die, but it's a happy ending because the sky is open. He sees the angels, he sees the Lord, he knows where he's going. And it's a happy ending because he stands up for faith in such a way that builds up the rest of the church. So when the church is scattered, they don't go and hide in a hole. They go and share the gospel with everybody they come across. So, unhappy endings can have very happy endings, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful questions and interaction with us. We are running out of time, but this has been a very helpful, beneficial webinar for everyone. Um, Tessa, please share your final thoughts, your words of encouragement for our audience, how they can use compelling stories in their writing, fiction or nonfiction.
One thing I wanted to tell you is that I'm going to work on some notes, like a little outline for this session, and send that to Ramon so he can email it to you, so you can have it and go back, because I know I gave you a lot of information. And I do believe this will be available on Zoom later, Ramon. So for those who missed it, yes, you can see it again.
Recording. Yes.
And I just want to tell you, I wish I could see your beautiful faces. The very fact that you're giving your time for God and you're here, it means so much. It means you're pursuing your call. It means that you are, and it's not easy. It's not easy any place in the world to write, but some of you are coming from hard places. I just want to say, bless you. The Lord bless you for truly following and being obedient to God. It's not the number of people who are going to read your books that matter. You may have influence in the life of one person, and that's the one God is sending you out to. So forget about things. Don't measure your success by the measures of the world. God doesn't like that. Measure your success by God's calling. I pray the Lord will give you the tongue like the pen of a ready scribe, and fulfill his purpose for you, because that is his intention. And I pray that you will do valiantly with God as you write, because you will have to be valiant in this industry. It is not easy. You have to be, you have to endure. It's a hard work job. It's a lonely job, and you have to learn endurance in it. So I pray you will have that valiant heart to endure. And I'm just proud of you. I'm super proud of you for pursuing it.
Thank you, Tessa. Thank you, everyone. Ethan, Charles, I will send your question to Tessa. She will answer your question one on one in an email. Um, yeah, thank you, Janet Wilson. Thank you, Chern Chern, for your comments. Thank you for your appreciation of the webinar and Tessa's teachings. So we are so grateful that you're here and that you've interacted with us and with Tessa. And we hope to see you next month for our next webinar, free webinar. It's going to be how to write for young children with Ina Reyes. So we'll send out the invitation for that webinar. Continue to pray for MAI and are holding the Let World 2022 conference in Hungary. We continue to covet your prayers for that. Thank you, and God bless all of you. And thank you, Tessa, again for being with us and for sharing your expertise and experience in storytelling and writing compelling stories.
It's been my pleasure and honor. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone, for now.